Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Milnor. I am creative evangelist for Blurb, and today we are fortunate to be speaking with photographer Paul Gero. Paul, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dan. Thanks. How are you?
I'm good. So before we go any further, we have to delve a little bit into our background because you and I share a friendship that goes back to 1993. I was fresh off a journalism degree and a photojournalism degree, and I got an internship at the Arizona Republic newspaper in Phoenix, which was one of the two primary daily papers out of Phoenix. And you were already established there as a staff photographer. You'd been working for many years as a photographer. I came in as an intern, and I will begrudgingly admit that I did learn quite a few things from you over the years. Fast forward, my internship was supposed to last for 3 months, and I basically just lingered. I loitered around the paper for a year and a half. They finally said, you can't stay here. And I went to Central America. And when I came back to the US, I started freelancing for the Arizona Republic. And I rented a room at your house in Gilbert, Arizona, which was still farmland at the time. I can't imagine what it's like now. But there's something here. I introduced you as a photographer, but I think it's important for the audience to know that means different things to different people. And I know quite a few photographers who are successful commercial photographers, but they sort of view photography as a problem-solving endeavor. A job comes in, they solve the problem, and they move on. They're not people who would carry a camera on a daily basis. They would never document their own lives. You, on the other hand, seem to have had the concept of photography imprinted on you from the time you were a baby. I mean, you live and breathe. When I think back to the time that I rented a room at your house in Gilbert, all we talked about, every single thing in our lives was tied to photography. How did that start for you? Where did that start?
It started when I was 12, and I was doing a Boy Scout merit badge of all things. And in fact, I just found it let me see if I got it.
A Boy Scout merit badge.
Yeah.
Whoa. And where was this?
It was in Columbus, Wisconsin.
Oh,
Population 3789.
the
Tiny
Paris,
town.
the Paris of Wisconsin.
Yes. And it's a town about 20 miles from where I live now. But that's another story. But I started doing a Boy Scout merit badge, and the counselor for me was a newspaper editor. And he taught me how to process film. And when I first saw the tray develop, the print develop in the tray, I was just like instantly hooked. And it wasn't even my photo, it was his photo. And I was like, this is amazing. And I imagine it's kind of the same because about a week ago, my son helped me at a wedding. He's just turned 13.
Unbelievable.
And I gave him an A7S3 and an 85-1.8. And he could see the photo come up on the back of the screen. So that's his developing tray.
Yeah.
And he's got a really good eye, and he's got a good hand-eye coordination. So I used a lot of his photos in the wedding that I delivered to the clients, and they loved seeing him there, and he really enjoyed it. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, I don't want to push him into it unless he wants to do it. But
Sure.
I mean, I just kind of fell in love with it when I was that age. And I kind of got out of it near the last 2 years of high school when I got really into sports. I was running a lot, doing cross country and track. But
I think
then in
I
college,
remember seeing 4x6 color prints of that.
yeah. And then I got back into journalism freshman year in college, and then I got back into photography at the end of my freshman year. And since basically 1979, 1980, it's been just pedal to the metal with photography, and now other things too that are related, video and
Sure.
editing and all that stuff. But
I think
it's
I
always
think
rooted in that photography.
I think for a lot of people, the same thing for me, watching an image come up in the developing tray and just being like, wow, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm sort of hooked on this. But I think also too, I think with you in particular, there's a level of, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but obsession about photography. It's not something that, you talk about the last 2 years of high school. I think for a lot of people, the last 2 years of high school are either wild or you're trying to find yourself. And so
Right.
to lose track of something like photography, it kind of makes sense. But journalism in particular, this obsession, for me, it began as an obsession to record things. It was really with a pen and paper first, and then being sent to an assignment as a reporter, and then them saying at the last minute, hey, would you mind taking a camera? We don't have a photographer to assign. And the second I saw that image print in the paper, I was like, that's it for me. The writing will continue, but I'm going to be a photographer. And it becomes this level of obsession that I think is hard for a lot of folks to understand. And how does that, like when journalism became the thing, how did that impact you? Because you ended up working in Washington, D.C., you worked in Chicago. These were big, high pressure papers. This is not an easy job. It is the ultimate training ground to be a photographer. What was that like, getting sucked into the vacuum of journalism?
I just lived the life that I wanted to live. I wanted to go to Chicago, and I made it happen. I was lucky enough to make it happen, but it took work. I mean, I had a kind of a plan. And then ending up in DC wasn't really my ideal. I thought I'd end up in New York before DC. I didn't even really think about DC, but it was kind of my ticket out of Chicago. And I was transferred there for the Chicago Tribune in their Washington bureau. And I mean, it was a great thing. It was probably the toughest years of my life, 25 to 30. They were really hard years. There were some great moments, but they were hard years too. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know. I just felt like I was kind of floundering in some ways. And I mean, while I was interested in politics, I just absolutely despised Washington. I hated the place. And
that's always healthy.
And so that made it really tough to kind of do this work, because it was so repetitive, and I felt like I was being used by politicians on both sides of the aisle as kind of their public relations machine. And now it's only worse. It's only magnified. But in '89, right after the inauguration of George Herbert Walker Bush, the paper wanted me to come back to Chicago, and I just didn't want to go back. I didn't see any options.
You didn't miss the winters in Chicago?
No, it wasn't so much that. It was just, I just didn't want to go backwards. I wanted to go forwards, and I thought going back would have been kind of
that makes sense.
Kind of an acknowledgement that my life wasn't moving forward. And it wasn't that I loved Washington. I did not want to be there, but it was like the better alternative than going back to a place that I'd been before. And so that lasted for about 18 months. And then I just like, I got to get out of here. And it was right about the time I turned 30, and I was like really kind of like searching, like I tend to do on my decades.
Yeah.
But I just said, I got to get back into newspapers, but I didn't really consider going back to Chicago.
Sure.
Started looking around and ended up meeting an old editor at the Chicago Tribune. He was now at the Arizona Republic, and we reconnected and started talking. And a few months later, I went out there for an interview. And by the end of the summer of '90, I was moving out to Phoenix right as it was about 105.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When I started my internship in '93, I think it was a year where they set the consecutive record days of 115 degrees in a row. And the first assignment I ever did was to go to ASU and photograph a high diver. And I laid down on the concrete platform on like the 10-meter platform, shooting down on the whatever it is, the 5-meter, and I burned the inside of my elbows, and for 3 months I had burns on my elbows. Yes. And I thought, yeah, this is pretty hot. But you're leading me into the next question very eloquently, is that you knew something wasn't right. You loved journalism, you loved newspapers. Chicago wasn't the place. It was initially, but then it wasn't.
Well, it was, but then it was the next place, next place.
And then DC became the place. And then you realized, okay, I'm not loving this. I don't want to go back to Chicago. So you're in essence beginning the series of pivots that you've made throughout your career. And so
it even started in college, because I was going to a small college. And then in 1980, I took a semester in Chicago and met John White from the Sun-Times and decided I've got to get into newspapers. And so that meant transferring. So I transferred to Marquette, because the Milwaukee Journal usually hired 4 interns that summer and 1 was local. So it was a very premeditated move to go to Marquette. I mean, I wanted to go there, but I also knew that it would put me in a position where I could really kind of connect with the Journal and Sentinel, which it did. And it ended up giving me an internship, which led to Chicago, which led to everything else. So
Sure.
all of these things are just kind of like scratching my own itch and following my own kind of yearnings, because I just never was told that I couldn't. So
Yeah. So tell me something. For me, the newspaper is the ultimate training ground to be a
yeah,
photographer, because not only is the pressure of a daily deadline, the pressure of an editor, the pressure of the fact that your work is going to be seen by potentially upwards of 1 million people when it hits the paper, and also the range of assignment and the nonstop perpetual surprises that you had on a daily basis, where in the morning you'd go in and get your basket of assignments and maybe there's 3 things. But also in the middle, you're driving from one to another and you get a 911 page, which we had at the time. And it's like brush fire in the middle of downtown Phoenix, and you have to deviate from your plan, cover this. It is, you never knew from minute to minute what was happening. So you land in Phoenix, you've got a full-time staff position at the paper. How good of a training ground was that for what you ended up eventually doing in the wedding business and the portrait business, which we're going to get to in a minute?
it really filled out the gaps that I had in my work. I got to do a lot more sports, which I had done a bit in Chicago, but kind of left that behind pretty much when I was in DC. And kind of that was really a lot of fun. Probably the most fun. That summer that you came in was the year the Suns went to the finals.
Yep.
And it was without a doubt the most fun year I've ever had in journalism to this day. And then I was also pushed into doing more things with lighting and using bigger format cameras, which were trying to give you a different look. So I always looked at newspapers as a great place to practice your skills. And whether you were wanting to do documentary work, whether you wanted to do large format portraiture, whether you wanted to do sports, they all gave you a kind of a playground to do it. But I always kept the goals in mind, and the goals were not newspapers. The goals were beyond newspapers. They were magazines and books.
Yeah.
Because to me, those were the benchmarks. So I may be doing an assignment for the business section for the Arizona Republic, but I, in my mind, was doing it for Fortune magazine. And I was doing a sports assignment for Sports Illustrated.
So let me explain this to the audience, because this is at the time. Let's go back to, let's say, 1993, which is when I got my internship. At the time, there was an established pathway or protocol for becoming a photographer. So in many ways, it was get an internship at a major newspaper, hope to do a good job, and parlay that into a staff position at a newspaper. You did that for a few years, you learned your craft, and at the same time, you began to Paul's point, looking at the parallel universe of the professional commercial editorial photography world. So you worked as a newspaper photographer, but if on the side, you might have begun freelancing for, if you were in news, maybe you were freelancing for Time or Newsweek or US News and World Report, with the idea being that at some point, your freelance business would take off to the level that you could leave the newspaper, and then you'd become a full-time editorial photographer, and then potentially parlay that into commercial and advertising gigs where there were more money to support your own personal projects. That was kind of the roadmap that all of us were trying to do. And I think the key word here and the key point, and you've done it as many times and as successfully as anyone I know, is the pivot. And what you're talking about in this case is really the slow pivot where you're inside. It's not the pivot that we're going to talk about in a minute, where you jump from being a journalist to being a wedding photographer. That to me is a major shock, because I did the same thing. And I would call that more of a, not a jarring pivot, but a pivot of culture, definitely culture clashes. So you're still at the paper, you're now starting to do editorial work, and tell us where some of these, you mentioned book as well. At the time, what were some of the books of photography that you looked at and said, I want to be that person?
I was looking at Salgado's work, like a lot of us were.
Yeah. Sebastian
Smith,
Salgado.
Eugene Smith had a big influence on what I wanted to do. William Albert Allard, Bill Allard from the Geographic was a huge, huge inspiration, because what I saw from him was fine art color photography of real moments. He was the first one to really do it like that, I think. And Eugene Smith was the classic storyteller.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
He's the best.
Salgado was the aesthetic black and white photographer who made beautiful photos of people with real empathy. And then you saw somebody like Jim Noctway, who made the most unbelievable war photos, haunting war photos. They were probably some of the most artful photos of people in suffering that I've ever seen. And it's, I don't mean that to be dismissive, but it's just, I just couldn't do the work that Jim did. And I tried to think, and I thought that I could do that work, but I just realized that that's not the way I wanted to live.
Same with me. And I got fortunate because at UT Austin, where I went to school, on my very first semester, even though I wasn't allowed to take her class, Maggie Stieber came in, and she had done her book, Dancing on Fire, about Haiti. And I saw that work and said, I want to do what she's doing. And I looked at that body of work and said, that is a classic, top-notch reportage body of work. And then the book from Aperture, and I was like, I want to be that person. And so I was so fortunate, even though they said, no, you're a transfer student, you can't take this class, my roommate took it, and I was able to sort of, vicariously live through him in this class. And I was like, that's who I want to be. And those are the impact of those books. Telex Iran, for me, when going to the half price bookstore in Austin and finding Gil Perez Telex Iran, Abbas's book on Mexico, they just seared themselves into our psyches of, once you see those, you can't unsee them.
Right.
And the bar has been set. Seeing Gil Perez's work and coming out of a classic traditional photojournalism school, and all of a sudden seeing his compositions, I was like, what is this? I actually, the story. I didn't buy the book because it freaked me out. I was like, no, I can't deal with that. And then realizing years later, I should have bought that book. It's like a classic. But let's talk a little bit now about the end of the journalism world for you. And you make a major pivot into the wedding photography world, which I had done as well. So I have a pretty good idea of what this was like. But explain how that happened.
Well, in 2000, I met my wife at a wedding, and she was from South Africa. I didn't want to date women who lived in Scottsdale, but yet I would get engaged after 10 days to a woman who lived 9,000 miles away, but that's just the way it goes. And we ended up getting married a year after we met, and we were going to church on Christmas. And I looked at her and I said, what would you think of if we left? Because she had been in advertising when she lived in Cape Town, and she could now work. She had her work permit, she had her green card and her Social Security card, so she could actually legally work now. And I was getting a little tired of Phoenix. I'd been there for 12 years, and I kind of felt like it's run its course for me.
Sure.
And I didn't want to get trapped anywhere. And I felt like if I would have stayed there, I'd still be kind of commiserating about life at the newspaper and all that stuff. And I just didn't want that.
You wanted to change.
I wanted to change, and I didn't want to spend another summer in Phoenix. It was just enough of it.
Yeah, it's tough, I have to admit.
But the funniest thing though, Dan, is I tell people now that I'm back in Wisconsin. When I was a kid, all I wanted to do was get the hell out of Wisconsin.
Yeah. Because
I wanted to basically go through a summer where you never got a rain out for a baseball game. And of course, you move to Phoenix and you never get a rain out.
You're not practically. You could get a heat out. So you made the change. You not only left journalism and went into the wedding field, but you also
we moved to California,
to Southern California.
Yeah.
And so
I figured if we were gonna leave, we were gonna get as close to the ocean as possible.
Yeah, and so that's a common trend when people leave the desert. They head straight to the closest body of water. So you did weddings for a long time. You were very successful at that. And then there was an eventual pivot. And this is where kind of the bulk of where this conversation is headed, which is you pivot into the portrait world. And going from journalism to wedding is a total culture shock. But going from weddings into portraiture is a much more linear kind of field, because as a wedding photographer, you are making a lot more portraits. So tell us about the going into the portrait business.
Well, the hardest thing was for me to realize that retail photography is very different than photojournalism. And you have to kind of adopt a mindset of marketing and selling that a lot of people just can't make that can't bridge that gap. And it's not easy because there's no guarantees with it. And you're selling something to somebody that's really not essential. I mean, they don't need it to live or breathe, or you know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
it's
it's a
something that,
luxury.
yeah, it's kind of a luxury item. And the thing of it is there's portraiture is not something that people they will want it years from now, but they don't always have an urgent need to do it. Whereas the wedding is got a time critical element. It's
Sure.
like 6, 8, 12 months away. Whereas a portrait is something that people say, yeah, I'll get around to it, but they don't have any real urgency. But then they turn around and their kids are grown, and then they haven't had any photos of them other than iPhone snaps. So part of portraiture is making people kind of really come to grips with that, I think, so that they realize the fleeting nature of our world
Yep.
and how
It's a
fast our
good
kids
point.
grow up. I mean, you've got 6,700 odd days from 0 to 18 years. And then your kids go off to their next thing, whatever it is, whether it's trade school, traveling, college, whatever. And then, what do you do? So you have a very, very finite amount of
Finite
time with
time.
kids.
That's right.
And I'm seeing it in my own kids. And part of it is we had a child, our first child, and I realized I wanted to be around more on the weekends for her to watch her
Yep.
grow up, play sports and things like that. And so I kind of migrated out of weddings for a while. I'm doing more of them now, but I mean, we can probably get to that point. But at that time, I was trying to see my way out of weddings because it was getting a little bit,
Yeah.
it was time for a change. That's me.
Sure.
About every 5 years, I got to do something different.
So and you transfer into the portrait world, and I think your point about retail is a absolutely crux point here, because you are now working with the general public. You're not working as a journalist with a press credential and with a journalistic organization behind you. You are front and center dealing with the public, and you're also selling, to your point, something that's kind of a luxury item. And also, I think the technology now, because everyone has a phone in their hand, they don't necessarily feel like, well, I'm kind of making pictures as I go along, so I don't necessarily need to hire someone on the outside. But portraits, to me, it's an incredible skill. The idea of being able to go into a scene quickly makes someone relaxed enough to be able to work. But what I also love about portraiture is there is no deadline and timeline like you're talking about. But the one time of year potentially where there is a difference in strategy, a change in strategy, would be the seasonal holiday approach to doing a wedding business, a portrait business. So tell us about the seasonal approach and like how that impacts your yearly approach.
Well, I've got a client, for example, that I photographed their wedding in '08, and they're back in California, and I've been photographing them every year since they've had their kids. And I'm going back again in November, and I'm going to photograph them, and
Cool.
we do a book every year.
That's cool.
And that's the thing that's really, it's one of the nicest things that came out of the wedding world, is getting to know people beyond the
Sure.
weddings and seeing their families grow up, because they're a little bit younger than our kids, but it's really an honor when people allow you into their lives like that.
For sure.
And you're so right that portraits take a skill set to get people comfortable, especially if you're on location and you have to kind of figure out where you're going to do the shoot, if you need to use lights or not or whatever. But that's all a result of newspapers. The newspaper training is the foundation of all of this work, because newspapers gave you chops. They gave you scales to practice. You had 3 to 5 assignments a day, 5 days a week,
Yep.
in a variety of things that you may not even know what you were going to get that day. And the next thing you know, you've got some serious skills.
Yep.
And it's just that day-to-day practice. And that is what's missing so much now in most of the world, in the photo space, is because people just do a wedding once a week. Well, you can't get your skills refined by doing it that way. You've got to give yourself some project or something, I think, to keep you constantly evolving as a photographer, getting better.
Sure.
Because if you don't get better and you just kind of stagnate, it's not for me, it's not fun. So
Yeah, I mean, I think if people knew what the day in the life of a newspaper photographer was like, I think they would laugh hysterically because it's controlled chaos. And to your point, you have to perform under pressure. What I loved about, I had a honeymoon with, no pun intended, I had a honeymoon with my wedding photography for five years, I would say. And then like you, at some point I was like, I need to sort of transition out of this. Portraiture sort of just slotted right in. My neighbor across the street came over and said, hey, can you photograph my kids? And I said, absolutely not. And she said, great, and just left them in my living room. And I was like, I don't know what to do with these kids. And that's how my portrait career began. But seasonal for me, holiday for me was tactical in the sense that oftentimes there were other family members together at the same time. And I didn't necessarily run any kind of financial strategy in a different way at holiday. But to your point, I would photograph the same people again and again and again, sometimes up to 4 times a year with the same family. But holiday always had that extra element where it did feel almost like there was a slight time constraint, but also again, because there were additional family members there. So how does that, do you run any kind of like, pricing changes or specials or anything like that at holiday time?
I don't. I just keep it the way I've been doing it for the last few years. So there is a built-in sense of urgency, like you say, because of the holiday, and a lot of people want to do a card, although not as many do them as they used to.
Sure.
But even so, I think people want to use the holiday as their annual kind of marker of where their kids are and where their family is. I know I have many repeat clients. I may not do them every year, but some I do every other year when I come back to California. Or here I'm doing seniors because that's a big deal for here, because that marks this passage from one age to the next. And so that's kind of a natural one here. There's other people that do other life stages like newborns and that's just not me. I mean, I always redirect them to a local woman here in town who loves doing newborns, and she does such a great job. But I like kids when they start getting mobile, when they start having personality. Oh, yeah. But I find as my own kids have gotten older, my clientele has kind of followed them in age.
Sure.
So I'm doing less and less younger kids, more and more tweeners and teenagers and seniors, and then the odd family session, and then weddings too.
And let's talk a little bit about like some of the challenges in the portrait world. Holiday withstanding, obviously end of year, there's kind of a time crunch. But what are some of the challenges in the portrait world?
I think it's getting people to put a value on the photography that will allow you to have a sustainable income. Because if you do shoot and burns for $150, you'll never make it. You'll burn out.
So before you go any further, let's talk a little bit about that, because this is a bit of the financial strategy variance within the portrait world. So a lot of times and I'm not saying any of these strategies is the right way or the better way, but you often have different philosophies when it comes to pricing. And this doesn't just include holiday, but it's pricing in general. You'll have photographers who will have a high upfront fee to do a shoot, and then their products that they're positioning and selling on the back end may be lower in value in terms of lower in price point. Or you have people that have a very low initial shooting fee, but the products that they sell on the back end, so it's prints and books and things like that, they will spend a lot of time sort of educating the client as to why these things are so important and why they're built the way they are, why they're printed the way they are. And so those come with a much higher price tag. So it's just a difference in philosophy of getting a fee up front, or getting a high fee up front, low fee up front, versus high prints on the back end, low prints on the back end. So,
and to that point, Dan, one of the things I noticed is that I think it's harder to get a higher fee for portraits than, say, a wedding. Because people have been planning for weddings for 20 some years.
Yeah.
Whereas portraits are something that people think of, well, it's just a portrait every year. It's not like,
right.
But then, so sometimes there's a barrier to entry because of price.
Yep.
So and then the shoot and burn model, which is shooting and delivering the files, is often done by photographers who are just trying to break in, although it's not always the case. So, and it's not to malign that strategy, because everybody starts somewhere, but you eventually have to get to a point where you realize that what's your time worth? What's your value?
Yeah, and just to explain that a little more, what Paul's talking about referencing is doing a shoot and burning, and that means that you would show up at a shoot with a portrait client, make those images, burn those to whatever compact flash, upload them, and then walk away. And often those shoots are done at a fairly low price point. And to Paul's point, a lot of times people are just trying to break into the industry. They're just trying to get their footing, but it's not a really successful long-term strategy. And again, that has really nothing to do with a holiday campaign. That's just it's a tough strategy for any kind of portrait business over the long haul. It may work to help you successfully land a few key clients, but at some point you have to change that model and go back to really trying to educate clients about the difference between, let's say, a snapshot with a cell phone and an actual portrait. And I think, again, portraiture to me is really a masterful training ground for other kinds of photography. It's a lot more difficult than it looks like on the surface because it's so much about psychology, especially if depending on who you're photographing, the age of the person you're photographing. Young kids, you load a Hasselblad with a roll of film, and young kids are all in. They're just intrigued on the minutia of like, what is this thing? I've never seen it. Whereas a 15-year-old, you're not going to have that luxury. So so the challenges of portraiture, to your point, we're basically just trying to educate people as to sort of the value of what they were getting.
Yeah. And also, I think part of it too is just the thought that, well, I can do this myself. But the reality is you can take photos of your own kids, but you can't really be in photos with your kids if you're taking the photos. So that's the other kind of bridge that they have to jump to get to that point where they hire somebody. And I look at photography as it's not something that everybody appreciates or wants, but the ones who do see the difference and they value it. And that's kind of how I've led my life anyway. Has always felt like if I did the best work that I was capable of doing and shared it, I was always going to find my kind of level, my people, I guess, the people who would support me doing what I do. And that's always been the case for almost 40 years now. So it's pretty wild.
So this is my idea here. Tell me if I'm flawed. So when you work as a newspaper photographer, it's not like you're going to get a photo essay. They're not going to give you 5 pages and 10 images every day. It's primarily a single image per assignment. And I think living in the age that we do, in the digital age where imagery is instantaneous, it's almost endless. Portraiture is very similar in my mind to journalism, because when I would talk to clients, and again, whether it was a holiday campaign or a shoot in the middle of March or April, I was in the same boat. I was trying to tell them, I'm not here for Facebook. I'm not here for volume. I'm here for a single print that hangs on the wall for you, for the kids who are in the photograph, and for their kids and their kids and their kids. I'm looking for a historical moment, and I only need one. And that was a perpetual struggle that I had to work with people, because again, and I love the phone and I love having the ability to shoot pictures nonstop, but there is a difference between that and a classic portrait, making a portrait of someone. And I think that is where the value comes in to photography, to professional photography. Am I off base, or is
no,
that...
I think you're right on, but I also think that there's a place for long form story documentation of families too, that may encompass that one hero shot, but also many, many supporting photos in a book. Like almost they become a photo essay in and of themselves. I mean, that's kind of what I've done with my own family, although less so as they get older, because when they were little, they were fair game. It was like,
yeah,
get over here.
But now they're independent humans.
Now my daughter can drive out and leave me. So
that just blows my mind to think that your son is 13 years old. That just gets numbers running through my head. But
yeah, because you photographed him when he was 10 days. You saw him when
he was just jelly.
Yeah.
You said the key word. You said the word that lights up my entire life, which is book.
Yeah.
You were the first photographer that I knew that had a desktop inkjet printer in probably 1990, had to be 95 or 96, because
Epson stylus.
Epson stylus, and we made prints on your office and laid them out on your living room floor. Neither one of us had seen anything like this before. That immediately put the hooks in me that this was the future for me. Was every single project I did would be completed in either book, magazine, or zine form. You've been a book collector for a long time. Tell us how you use book in the portrait biz.
In the portrait biz, I use book as a way to showcase like 20 or 30 images from a session. I've used books to do photo projects throughout time too, like football. I'm doing a football project now. It's in video, but in the past I've done it in book form. So I've always thought that I always felt that books were the pinnacle. Magazines were like just a step below. And it all revolved around the quality of the printing and how the photos came across. The ones that you wanted to just hold on to and savor were usually in books. And now I find that the printing that we do in books that are done digitally with indigos or whatever they're using are just incredible. I mean, they are, to me, rival anything that was done in the 90s. And to think that we can make a book one off is insane. And it just totally blows up the paradigm of what's possible. And I still always believe in the power of books. And now sometimes though, I think there's a stigma, oh, well, it's self-published or it's vanity or something like that, but I could care. I mean, it's like,
Well,
no, this is a project that I started, I delivered, I shot, and I finished.
I think there's definitely a stigma about self-publishing. There always has been, and
Yeah.
my guess is there always will. I think a lot of those folks don't understand that people were self-publishing before they were publishing. There were no photo book publishers. People were putting books out on their own. And I think the stigma is changing, but I think oftentimes, the self-published world, it is filled with books that look self-published. And so I think that there's a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to making books, because there's a lot involved. There's editing your own work, there's sequencing, there's typography, there's choosing materials and trim sizes. And so it takes a while. It's like a language that you have to learn. But I think for you and I, we were fortunate to get exposed to just some of the most incredibly solid photo books that we were exposed to early in our careers, that again, once you can't unsee those, and the bar has been set. And if you have the gumption to start studying what those are, it's just it's the most wonderful experience to see your work realized on the printed page. For me, every single portrait assignment ended in book form. That was built into my finances, built into my financial plan. And the customers, I would use the word relief, because yes, technically, if they had the files, they could make a book on their own. But as a photographer, if a client can make a book that's as good as the books that you're making, you should probably practice your bookmaking, because they were just relieved that they didn't have to do it. And for me, the book became a continuation of my branding. The clients were paying for me and my branding by paying for these books that they would then put out into the world, that other people would see and be like, whoa, who did this? And they'd see my studio in the back. And that's how I got jobs. And I've told this before, I'm not sure if you and I have spoken about it, but I went into clients' offices who I had never worked for, and they had my books on their table. So how that happened, I have no idea. But is that how you use books as well?
It's varied. It's changed. It's ebbed and flowed. I mean, I think, well, not one of my photo books, excuse me, but a book that I wrote about digital wedding photography changed the course of my career too. Back in 2004,
I remember that.
I wrote a book called Step-by-Step Digital Wedding Photography, and it took like 8 months to do it. And I was dealing with a British book publisher, and it was sold to an American printer, and it sold thousands of copies it was one of the first books about digital wedding photography. And it
Wow.
set me up for being sponsored by Canon at that time. And then down the road that ended, and then Sony came into the picture in 2014. But books have always been they've always been a kind of like an icebreaker, because people really see that, oh, this person's serious. Whenever I would print a printed piece. It meant that you had to bring your ideas together and formulate what you wanted to say and how you wanted to say it. And books are even more magnified than even just a promotional piece. But all of these things are something that you can leave behind and something that's different than just a business card. And a
Oh
book
yeah.
can be a more than just a business card. And I think your conversation about doing books for all your portrait clients is really a great thing, and it's made me kind of think about now, like the last few years where I've just pretty much done weddings where I've delivered the set of images digitally without a
Yep.
print product. Sometimes they come back and do an album, but more often not they don't. And yet the thing of it is what do they have to show for it? They've got a really nice gallery of images online. They've got a nice collection of images on their hard drives, but unless they print them, are they really a print? Are they really a
Look,
photo?
look, I'm jaded. I'm the
Yeah,
wrong person to ask, because to me, it doesn't matter if I go to the border for a day and do a photo essay. To me, it is not complete until it's in print somewhere. And again, that could be one copy of a zine for myself, but the critical thought that's required towards your imagery to make a publication is simply different from what I find in the digital space. But again, I'm
right.
jaded. I'm jaded. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, and there's one
Okay.
thing I want you to talk about, which I think is a pretty fantastic story, which is the CHOC Hospital book that
Okay.
you've done in the
Yeah.
past, and using photography and books to do some good. Here's some really nice philanthropy, and also working with folks in need. So tell us about CHOC.
The idea for the book Children's of Orange County, which benefited Children's Hospital of Orange County, came from a Australian photographer by the name of Tero Sade. And I had seen him present in Orange County probably in '07, I think, '07, '08. And it was right at the time when Kate was really young. So I guess it was probably right around those years. And I saw his presentation, and his whole business model was rooted around that low price of entry, higher prices for prints. But then he did this portrait project, which had a charity component. And I saw the quality of his books, and I was blown away because they reminded me of the Day in the Life books.
Oh yeah.
And these were all printed in Australia. And so that really just hooked me, and I adopted his business model when it comes to pricing and selling. And at first I thought that business model was a bad business model, but really what it did is I understand it's really rooted in human psychology. Is people want to do portraits, but they don't often have a reason to do it. And if the barrier to entry, that is to say the session fee is very high, they may not do it. And then plus doing the charity project, he would take the session fee and donate it, or I don't know how he did it. But what I would do is I would have people write the check for $100 made payable to CHOC. And I would take their check and send it to the charity, and then they would get a receipt from the hospital. And in doing that for 9 years, we raised $70,000 for that hospital,
Wow.
which was pretty amazing. But we did hundreds and hundreds of kids. I mean,
Oh yeah, yeah.
I got
And
so good at doing.
but you also
kids
did a
portraits.
book each year, right?
Yeah,
It
there
was
was
called The Kids of
yeah,
Orange County.
right. And it would be one portrait of each child with their first name in the book, and that became a thing that people could buy. When I first started doing it, if they bought my top collection, I gave them that book. But the cost of doing the printing in overseas was really high. It cost me $5,000 to maybe do 150 copies. It was
Yeah.
not cheap.
Yep.
But now with Blurb, I transitioned over to Blurb to do those books near the end of it the last 5 years, because it was so easy to do it. And I really loved like the quality of the paper stock when they got to that real heavy watercolor paper.
Yep.
That to me was superb.
That was the
And
Proline
yeah,
papers came in.
yeah, when they came in,
uncoated.
exactly. And then the covers everything just got better and better. The covers looked better, and I could show it online to people, and it became the way that I delivered the books after a while.
Still to this day, those Blurb books are some of the best looking, and obviously you're a good technician when it comes to your work and your color space and knowing how to print. They are absolutely stunning books. But to me,
Thanks.
there is no way to ignore that book or that project. One, $70,000 for CHOC Hospital, that in itself is incredible. But also, I can remember the covers of those books in my head. And I haven't looked at those books in probably at least 10 years. And I remember the covers of those books because they were so fantastic. And again, to me, the book is the testament of that goes perhaps not one step further than the digital space, but just one step in a different direction from the digital space. And I love the fact that most of us are living in a hybrid world where we're obviously we're not going to abandon the digital space anytime too. It's a wonderful place, but print is a very, very separate thing. And what I love personally is that even after all these years, it's still revered by people like you and I, and also the upper echelons of the industry.
I also find that when people come by to look at photos, because I have some big photos here in our studio space, and some big ones and some small ones, but I mean, even a 16 by 24 looks small on a big wall.
Yeah.
And they really get that when they see it. And I've got a 40 by 60 print that I've had for years. It's hanging on the wall over there, and people look at it and say, wow, but it actually looks really amazing, because you're saying when you put a photo on the wall, this is the one that I value the most. This is the one I want to look at from now on, because you're going to pass it every day.
Yeah.
And if you've picked the wrong one, you're always going to remember it. Every day you're going to look at it and say, there was one that was better.
Yeah, one that's better. Well, I think, to use an old film analogy to wind this talk down, going back to the beginning of your career, the beginning of my career, which was in the analog darkroom, there were times where you mixed the chemistry, you got your paper ready, you had everything set, and you put that negative in the negative holder, and you looked at it through the enlarger and looked down at it and said, this isn't good enough. And you took it out of the holder and you poured the chemistry back and you went back out in the field, because you just knew you had gotten to a point of refinement when you couldn't fool yourself anymore into thinking like, okay, this is good when it's not. And that's what I love about photography. It's a perpetual challenge. It's a language that you can never fully master. So last thing, what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, what I'm working on now is I'm doing more weddings again, surprisingly, since I moved back to Wisconsin. But I don't do like huge volume. I mean, if I do 15 a year, that's a lot. But I still love them for the kind of the day. And then I'm doing more and more senior portraits.
Okay.
And that's going to continue to evolve and grow. This year, I think I've done maybe a half dozen. It was a smaller year this year than last year. Was very busy for some reason. I don't know why, but so last year was a different year. I do a lot of sports projects. I photograph my kids doing sports, and I share those photos. And I use those as a way to kind of build brand recognition, name recognition here in the area. And I find that it's kind of a goodwill thing. So the technology has evolved so much with these cameras. I'm using the Sony A1 to shoot sports, and this thing is like not even fair, because it tracks eyes and shoots 30 frames a second. And I mean, you still have to know where to point it, but I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? This camera
have changed.
Yeah, it's like that would go through 36 rolls. That would be 1 second frames. For one roll of 36 frames. It would be changing. I mean, we thought in the 80s, in 88, at the Seoul Olympics, Canon had a camera that went 10 frames a second.
Oh yeah.
And it was this thick. It was huge. And I mean, that's one roll of film in 3 seconds. It's gone.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the camera technology. I just sold some gear and I'm about to buy some new stuff. And yeah, it just feels in some ways like a computer in your hand, as opposed to a straight camera. But yeah, it's exciting because I don't know, for me, I still love photography. And I think one of the things that you've got going for you that I sort of backed into